In 1955, two experienced cave divers descended into the depths of Radium Springs, one of Georgia's 7 natural wonders. Their goal was to explore a mysterious, uncharted section of the cavern, said to hold the most breathtaking and beautiful submerged chamber on Earth. Driven by an obsession for discovery and the thrill of the unknown, they unknowingly plunged straight into a deadly trap waiting below. Despite warnings to stay away, they went in anyway. In the end, only one diver would return to the surface. These are the final moments of the Radium Springs diving tragedy. Radium Springs is located in southwest Georgia, about 12 miles east of Albany, Georgia. It was originally called Blue Springs, but that changed in 1925 when radium was detected in its crystal clear blue waters, which maintain a consistent temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Today, we understand that exposure to radium can lead to serious health issues. In fact, prolonged exposure can even lead to a slow and painful death. Once radium enters the body, it mimics calcium and settles in the bones, where it wreaks havoc over time. The radiation it emits can destroy bone marrow, leading to anemia, while also weakening the bones and increasing the risk of bone cancer. Yet, back then, radium was believed to cure a variety of ailments like psoriasis, asthma, and rheumatoid arthritis. Murray Anderson first heard about Radium Springs Cave from a friend he met in a caving group. The stories intrigued him immediately. Radium Springs was a place shrouded in mystery, with vast, unexplored passages that no one had ever ventured into. Word had it that deep within the cave was an unmapped section just beyond a large cavern. This part of the cave was rumored to be the most beautiful and stunning underground chamber in the world. However, there was a reason only a handful had ever made it past this point. The path to this section was filled with dangerous obstacles, such as sharp and compressed tunnels or claustrophobic passages, but like a true thrill seeker, the difficulty and high risk involved in the dive only fascinated Murray more. Murray's obsession with the cavern was no secret to his friends. They often found themselves drawn into lengthy discussions about how they'd navigate the treacherous passages and what mysteries might await them in the hidden chamber. After much thought, they came to agreement that navigating these treacherous passages required absolute precision. Divers needed to carefully manage their air supply while squeezing through razor-sharp tunnels. At one point, the only way forward was to remove your air tank and squeeze through a section of the cave beneath a lake. This was the most terrifying part. If you got stuck, you weren't getting out. Divers had to angle their bodies and take shallow breaths, hoping their lungs would compress enough to slip through. But if they succeeded, they'd find themselves in the legendary unmapped chamber. The risk was enormous, but the reward possibly the most breathtaking sight on Earth. By the time Lieutenant Murray Anderson hit his late 20s, he was already a seasoned US Navy SEAL, boasting over 200 hours of dive experience. When he wasn't working for the government, he would spend his spare time exploring underwater cave systems around Georgia. Yet, all of his adventures couldn't prepare him for what was to come when he and his friend Donald decided to enter the Radium Springs cave system in 1955. Murray and Donald, in their excitement, broke almost every critical cave diving rule during this expedition because, well, back then, these guidelines weren't taught yet. The dive they had planned far exceeded their training and certification. What's worse is that they neglected to lay a continuous guideline from the cave's entrance, a lifeline in case they lost their way. They also only carried a single light source, a glaring error when cave divers are advised to carry multiple backups. And they ignored the standard rule of thirds for air management, a vital safety protocol that ensures divers have enough air to return to the surface. In fact, one local cave diving instructor pointed out that the rule of thirds wasn't even cautious enough for a cave as complex as Radium Springs. Yet, despite these warnings, they had made up their minds. Cave diving is far riskier than open water diving, which is already dangerous enough. While most divers prepare for potential equipment malfunctions and the effects of nitrogen narcosis, cave divers also face the added fear of getting trapped in tight spaces or lost in a maze of confusing passages. And in both types of diving, small problems can quickly spiral into deadly situations. Even the most seasoned divers can panic when things go wrong, and those split-second decisions can be the difference between life and death. Imagine the terror of being in a dark, mysterious cave with bulky breathing gear surrounded by murky, sediment-filled water, a kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of you. Despite the fear, recreational cave diving had been around for a long time, though it didn't really take off in the US until the 1950s to 60s. Back then, both the gear and the training were nowhere near as advanced as they are today. Murray's Navy SEAL training was solid, but most of his dives had been in open water. Still, he was highly respected within his diving club, especially compared to the other members, many of whom were just weekend hobbyists with little formal training. For a while, Murray had been itching to dive Radium Springs, and when he mentioned the idea to his fellow club member, Donald Garreau, Donald was all in. By mid-1955, both Murray and Donald were seasoned cave divers, at least by standards back then. They'd faced plenty of close calls in the past and knew all the risks that came with the sport, but the thrill and adrenaline were a huge part of what kept them coming back. The danger, the camaraderie, and the excitement of exploring places that few, if any, had ever seen made it all worth it. Years later, divers and geologists would discover that Radium Springs cave complex stretched 1,500 feet and featured a strange honeycomb structure. But back in 1955, Murray and Donald had no clue just how vast and complex it really was. They didn't know how deep it went, how many hidden passages and chambers existed, or what secrets lay within. For most people, that would be utterly terrifying, but for these two, the mystery only fueled their excitement. On a Friday morning in the summer of 1955, the pair arrived at the cave, ready for their highly anticipated adventure. Their goal was simple: dive deep, explore, and map as much of the uncharted sections as possible, and find that legendary, beautiful chamber before resurfacing. To maximize their time, they decided they would split up shortly after entering. This way, they could cover more ground than if they stuck together. But this decision came with risk. If something went wrong, neither would be able to help the other. Still, under the circumstances, they figured it was worth the gamble. Murray and Donald wasted no time getting ready, suiting up, and preparing their gear soon after arriving. It's important to remember, though, their diving equipment back in the 1950s was far heavier and more cumbersome than what's available today. High-quality commercial gear wasn't an option, so divers like Murray often made their own equipment and oxygen tanks, piecing them together from discarded parts and whatever odds and ends they could find at local hardware stores. By the time they waded into the blue water, it was nearly noon. Once they were chest deep, they placed their regulators in their mouths, submerged beneath the surface, and began the short descent to the partially hidden 3-foot cave opening at the bottom of the spring. Despite the risks, they chose not to anchor a safety line at the entrance, a lifeline that could have guided them back in case they got lost or faced an equipment failure. Safety lines are especially crucial when exploring unfamiliar cave systems, especially in caves filled with sediment, where visibility can drop to zero in a matter of seconds. And, as you'll soon see, this was a fatal critical error and misjudgment. Murray and Donald slipped through the narrow entrance and into the cave. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they slowly swept their homemade flashlights from side to side, trying to find the main passage. It didn't take long for them to notice that the cave floor was coated with a thick layer of sediment, adding an extra layer of risk to their already dangerous dive. Stirring that up would ruin their visibility, so they kept their movements as controlled and minimal as possible, swimming close to the top of the passage. Even their kicks had to be precise, flicking their fins sideways instead of up and down, no easy task in a tight, confining space. As they glided under a massive rock overhang, the last bit of natural light vanished behind them, leaving them in complete darkness. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly. The dive was calm, and they swam deeper and deeper into the cave, the water remained remarkably clear, and their flashlights cut through the darkness just enough to allow them to navigate without much trouble. Along the way, they passed several side chutes branching out from the main passage. They paused to glance into a few, but it was impossible to know how far they went, where they led, or whether they could even fit through. By the time they'd been underwater for about 30 minutes, they were 200 feet into the cave when Donald suddenly decided he'd had enough. A creeping sense of unease started to grip him, and panic was just around the corner. Something didn't feel right, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He motioned to Murray, signaling that he was heading back, and suggested Murray do the same, but Murray wasn't ready to quit yet. He hadn't ventured deep enough or encountered any serious obstacles yet, and more importantly, he still hadn't reached the legendary chamber that had consumed his obsession for years. He couldn't understand why Donald was so eager to turn around so soon. Their original plan was to split up and map unexplored portions of the cave, and Murray intended to stick to that plan. Using hand gestures and expressions, he made it clear to Donald that he wasn't ready to surface just yet. Donald, on the other hand, wasn't convinced. He tried once more to get Murray to join him, but when it was clear his friend had made up his mind, Donald gave a reluctant thumbs up, signaling that he was leaving. With a final glance at Murray, Donald turned 180 degrees and swam back toward the entrance, leaving his friend alone in the silent darkness of the cave. At that point, the water was relatively clear, with only a small amount of sediment disturbed. Donald, unaware of what was happening behind him, had already exited the cave. He swam to shore and began stripping off his cumbersome gear, relieved to be out. Meanwhile, as soon as Donald disappeared from view, Murray ventured deeper, slipping into a narrow side chute off the main passage. The further he went, the darker it became. His homemade flashlight was starting to dim, but with the entrance just a few hundred feet behind him, Murray felt confident there was no immediate reason to worry. But then, it hit him like a cold shock. He had been careless, dangerously careless. In an instant, a crushing realization slammed into him. He had just made a terrible mistake. Focused entirely on pushing forward, he had stirred up a significant amount of sediment from the cave floor without even noticing. Now, it had dispersed into the water, and visibility in the small passage dropped to almost zero in mere seconds. His already dim flashlight was rendered completely ineffective in the thick, sediment-choked water. In fact, the visibility was so poor that Murray could barely see his own hands, even when they were just inches from his face. Initially, Murray took some comfort in knowing that the cave entrance wasn't far away, but the situation was growing more dire by the second, and he knew he needed to get back to the main passage as quickly as possible. His breathing quickened as he reached out in a panic, grasping at the cave walls, desperately hoping to find the opening that led back to the main passage. Instead, his hands only encountered solid rock, the disorienting walls closing in around him. As panic fully set in, his breaths became faster and more erratic. In stressful situations like this, that's a natural reaction, but it came with dangerous consequences. His rapid breathing was burning through his remaining oxygen much faster than he had planned for. By now, he had been alone in the cave for over an hour. The air left in his tank was dwindling, and he knew it was nearing the point of no return. Back on the shore, Donald had no idea his friend was in such a dire situation. Murray had always been the more experienced diver and a far bigger risk-taker than him, so Donald wasn't too alarmed by the fact that his friend was taking his time. He knew Murray often pushed things to the limit, waiting until the very last minute to wrap up a dive. Yet, Murray also took dive safety seriously, so Donald's mind flipped between reassurance and creeping concern as the minutes dragged on. He kept telling himself that any moment now, Murray would break the surface, swim to shore, and they could move on from this nerve-wracking situation. But as more time passed, a troubling realization set in. Murray couldn't possibly have enough oxygen left. That's when the dread really hit. Something had gone horribly wrong. Donald was suddenly faced with three choices. He could stay put and hope against hope that Murray would miraculously reappear. He could gear up again and dive back into the cave to try and find his friend, praying he wasn't too late. Or he could call for help and report Murray missing, hoping that professionals would get there in time. He thought hard about going back into the water, but exhaustion was setting in. Most of his oxygen had already been used during the dive, and going back in with so little left was a risk in itself. In the end, Donald made the difficult call. He would err on the side of caution and report Murray missing. He quickly tracked down 2 other divers from the club, but by the time they arrived at Radium Springs, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. They knew the chances of finding Murray alive were slim, but they also knew time was of the essence. Maybe, just maybe, Murray had found an air pocket and was waiting for a rescue. With urgency in their minds, the 3 divers suited up, slipped into the cold spring water, and swam toward the cave entrance, retracing the exact steps Murray and Donald had taken earlier that day. It only took minutes to reach the entrance, but every second felt like an eternity. They had stronger lights this time, fresh batteries ready for the long haul, but the water was still thick with sediment. The visibility was awful. The particles stirred up from earlier hadn't settled, making the search all the more difficult. Donald led the way, entering the cave first. The other 2 divers connected themselves to the safety line and followed him into the dark, winding passage. Together, they pushed forward, heading straight for the spot where Donald had last seen Murray just hours before. But when they reached that point, Murray was nowhere to be found. Not a single piece of his gear had been left behind. They spent the next 2 hours scouring every passage they could, shining their lights into every corner, scanning into the abyss, but it was no use. The cave was a maze, and with each passing minute, their oxygen dwindled. Exhaustion began to weigh heavily on them, and the crushing realization that they were putting their own lives at risk began to set in. Reluctantly, they knew they had to call it. By the time they exited the waters, Donald was completely spent, emotionally and physically drained. His friends barely had enough strength to pull him from the water before he collapsed in front of a growing crowd that had gathered along the beach, waiting for news. But there was no news, only silence. When the Navy learned that one of their own SEALs was missing, they wasted no time. A team of highly skilled divers was flown in, but by the time they arrived, it was early the next morning, and Murray had already been trapped in the cave for nearly 20 hours. By then, the shoreline had transformed. Scores of curious onlookers camped out on the beach, while dozens more stood further back, watching anxiously as the Navy divers suited up and slipped into the water. With precision, the Navy divers descended to the bottom of the spring, quickly locating the safety line. They navigated through the cave's narrow entrance, disappearing into the dark system. Many rescue missions like this are long and grueling, often ending with the victims never being found. But this time, it didn't take long. Within minutes, the divers found Murray, floating near the top of the cave, exactly 200 feet in, where Donald had said they parted ways. Murray's regulator was out of his mouth, and his flashlight, the one that had failed him the day before, dangled from a lanyard on his diving harness. When Donald heard the news, his heart sank. He realized, with an overwhelming sense of regret, that he and the others had likely swum right beneath Murray during their search the previous day, but the water clarity had been so poor that they had no way of seeing him. It was also clear to Donald that Murray had been dead for hours. His oxygen would have run out long before the Navy divers even arrived. What made the whole tragedy even more devastating were the string of avoidable errors that led to his death. First, they had made the critical mistake of starting their dive too late, around noon. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal since they only planned to explore the cave for a short while. But when everything went wrong and precious time slipped away, the delay meant rescuers couldn't even begin their search until after nightfall. Another fatal decision was Murray's choice to continue alone when Donald exited the cave. Cave diving is treacherous enough when you have a partner, but the danger multiplies when someone ventures off solo. The final, perhaps most significant mistake was not using a safety line. For a cave as complex as Radium Springs, skipping that precaution was an egregious error. Murray wasn't familiar with the cave's layout, and without the line, he sealed his own fate. Murray Anderson became one of the earliest known cave diving fatalities in the United States. Because of the events that unfolded, the cave system beneath Radium Springs is now closed to the public. However, experienced divers still explore it occasionally for scientific and geological research. If there's any silver lining to this tragedy, it's that his death brought about several changes to cave diving protocol that likely saved lives in the years that followed. Murray's tragedy pushed for stricter guidelines, such as always using a safety line, carrying 3 flashlights, and the adoption of the rule of thirds for air management.